The research station on Kepler 438b's third moon had recorded ambient temperatures of negative 83 degrees Celsius for 17 consecutive planetary nights. Each night lasted 96 hours. The sixth night was approaching. Margaret Chen, 71 years old, had worked in the station's hydroponics bay for 8 years. She was the oldest human on the moon by 2 decades. The Viridian research team consisted of 14 members, all relying on the station's fusion-powered environmental systems and energy-based thermal barriers. Their species had evolved on a temperate world and had conquered cold through engineering rather than biology. On the afternoon of the 5th day, Margaret had begun digging. She chose a site 40 meters from the main habitat, near an exposed ridge of compressed ice that planetary surveys indicated was 4,000 years old. She used a thermal pickaxe from the maintenance bay and worked slowly, carving a descending tunnel at a 15-degree angle. The tunnel extended 3 meters into the ancient ice, then opened into a chamber roughly 2 meters in diameter and 1.8 meters high. Dr. Kelvin, the Viridian station director, had watched from the observation deck with 2 colleagues. They had not interfered. When Margaret returned to the habitat that evening, Dr. Kelvin had asked about the excavation. Margaret explained she was preparing a cold-weather shelter using Earth Arctic techniques, specifically those developed by the Inuit peoples of northern Canada and Greenland over thousands of years. She mentioned that ice, when properly structured, provided insulation values between R2 and R4 per inch, and that subsurface temperatures stabilized at depths below 3 meters. Dr. Kelvin had tilted his head, a gesture that indicated polite dismissal among his species. The station's energy barriers maintained interior temperatures at 22 degrees Celsius, regardless of external conditions. The barriers had functioned without interruption for 11 years across 4 different installations. The fusion core had redundant systems and multiple fail-safes. Margaret's shelter, he observed, seemed inefficient and labor-intensive. Margaret had nodded and returned to her quarters. She spent the next day lining the ice chamber with thermal blankets salvaged from decommissioned emergency kits, creating an air gap of 8 centimeters between the blankets and the ice walls. She brought in 4 sealed water containers, dried food rated for 2 weeks, a manual air recycler designed for emergency escape pods, and 3 chemical heating packs that required no power source. She also brought a waste management kit and her personal data tablet, which she set to minimum power mode. The ceiling of her chamber extended only 10 centimeters above the external ice surface. She carved 3 narrow ventilation channels, each 4 centimeters in diameter, angled upward to prevent snow accumulation. She covered the entrance tunnel with an insulated tarp held in place by ice anchors, leaving a small gap at the bottom for air circulation. The planet's predators had been documented in the 3rd year of the station's operation. They were designated Noctotherium kelvinii by the xenobiology team. The creatures measured between 1.6 and 2.1 meters in length, possessed 6 limbs adapted for movement across ice, and had evolved specialized organs that detected electromagnetic fields across a range of 0.1 to 500 megahertz. The station's energy barriers, thermal regulators, and communication systems all operated within this spectrum. The predators had learned to associate these signals with the presence of prey species. They hunted exclusively during the long nights, when their electromagnetic sensitivity provided advantage over visual predators. 3 packs of Noctotherium kelvinii had established territories within 15 kilometers of the station. Barriers had always kept them at a distance of at least 200 meters. On the evening of the 6th day, at hour 22 of the planetary rotation, the fusion core's secondary cooling system registered an anomaly. A micrometeorite fragment, no larger than 3 millimeters, had penetrated the station's outer hull during the previous night and lodged itself in a coolant relay junction. The primary systems had compensated automatically. No alarms had been triggered. At hour 41, as the night temperature dropped to negative 85 degrees Celsius, the primary coolant pump overheated. Automatic systems switched to backup protocols. The core continued to function, but at 62% efficiency. Energy barriers maintained their integrity, but drew more power to compensate for the increased thermal load. At hour 63, the backup coolant system failed. The Corps initiated emergency shutdown procedures. The entire process took 11 minutes. Energy barriers collapsed in sequence from perimeter to core. Internal temperature regulators shut down. Emergency batteries maintained life support and minimal heating to the central habitat module only. The external temperature was negative 83 degrees Celsius. Margaret had entered her ice shelter at hour 38 before the first system failure. This was her habit on every sixth night, a personal routine she had maintained for 14 months. She had told no one. The Viridians did not inquire about human recreational activities. Inside the chamber, with the entrance sealed and her body heat contained by the insulated space, the temperature stabilized at negative 12 degrees Celsius within the first hour. The chemical heating packs, activated one at a time, raised the temperature to negative 4 degrees. Margaret wore 4 layers of cold weather clothing and remained inside her thermal sleeping system, which was rated to negative 40 degrees. She remained warm. The ice itself prevented thermal radiation. The subsurface location eliminated wind chill. The small volume of air required minimal energy to maintain temperature. The chamber produced no electromagnetic emissions above 0.01 MHz, the level of natural background radiation. The first Noctitherium kelvinii reached the station at hour 68. The creatures had detected the energy barrier's collapse from a distance of 12 kilometers. Pack behavior indicated they associated the sudden absence of electromagnetic fields with system failure and potential access to prey. Within 40 minutes, all 3 packs had converged on the station perimeter. The Viridians had retreated to the central habitat module, which maintained internal temperature at 8 degrees Celsius on battery power. They had activated emergency beacons. The nearest rescue vessel was 14 hours away. The batteries would last 9 hours at current consumption rates. Dr. Kelvin had implemented conservation protocols and ordered all non-essential systems offline. The predators circled the station for 6 hours. They could detect the electromagnetic signatures from the habitat module's life support, communications array, and emergency lighting. They tested the exterior walls at multiple points. The walls held. The creature's hunting strategy relied on waiting. They had evolved in an environment where most technology eventually failed. At hour 74, the habitat module's batteries dropped to 18% capacity. Dr. Kelvin reduced heating to preserve communications. Internal temperature fell to negative 2 degrees Celsius. The Viridian physiology could tolerate brief exposure to negative 10 degrees, but suffered impaired cognitive function below negative 5 and tissue damage below negative 15. 3 crew members showed signs of hypothermia. At hour 81, Margaret emerged from her shelter. The planetary day had begun 14 minutes earlier. The predators had withdrawn to their dens at first light, following patterns documented in xenobiology reports. The external temperature had risen to negative 79 degrees Celsius. She walked to the station and entered through the emergency airlock, which functioned on mechanical systems. She found the Viridian crew huddled in the central module, conscious but moving slowly. She activated the manual override for the emergency heat distribution system, which drew from a reserve chemical fuel source designed for exactly this scenario, but which required manual ignition. The system had been installed during station construction, but never used. Most of the crew had forgotten it existed. Within 30 minutes, the habitat temperature rose to 7 degrees Celsius. The Viridians recovered. Dr. Kelvin accessed the maintenance logs and confirmed that the chemical reserve could maintain minimal heating for 72 hours, sufficient to reach the rescue window. Margaret returned to her ice shelter to retrieve her supplies. When she came back, Dr. Kelvin was waiting in the equipment bay. He asked how she had survived the night. She explained the principles of subsurface thermal insulation, the history of snow shelters in Earth's Arctic regions, and the electromagnetic silence of her location. She mentioned that the chamber had required no power and produced no detectable signals. The predators, she noted, hunted what they could sense. Dr. Kelvin examined the entrance to the ice shelter from the observation deck. He spent 11 minutes reviewing the construction. He made no comment on efficiency. He did not apologize. He requested detailed specifications for the archive. The rescue vessel arrived at hour 93. The Viridian crew transferred to the ship for medical evaluation. Repairs to the station would require 6 weeks. The facility was temporarily abandoned. Margaret remained on the surface for an additional 4 hours, filling in the entrance to her shelter and smoothing the ice. She left the chamber itself intact, 3 meters below the surface. The Viridians had already begun discussing the installation of passive backup shelters at all research stations in extreme environments. The designs would incorporate subsurface construction and thermal mass principles. They would require no power source. The proposal listed Margaret Chen as primary consultant. She had accepted the role, but had declined payment beyond her standard salary. She had pointed out that the techniques were not her invention. They were simply methods humans had developed over thousands of years, methods that worked because they relied on physics rather than engineering. The station logs recorded her survival with precise notation. External temperature, -83 degrees Celsius. Duration, 43 hours. Power consumption, 0. Electromagnetic signature, undetectable. Result, survival with no injury or physiological stress. The entry included no commentary. The data was sufficient.